Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Good evening, my good viewers, ladies and gentlemen. Here I am again with you this evening for the second part of my narrative on the subject of indigenous peoples of the world. A couple of days back, the International Day of the world's indigenous peoples was observed. And I had given you my first part as my initial narrative about the people at large, that is, indigenous peoples at large in the whole world. And today, this evening, I shall be with you giving the other part of my narrative, which is on the subject of Pakistan. The title of my narrative, as it was for the first part, it is also for the second part, is Indigenous Peoples, Part of Humanity. They really matter. Indigenous peoples, part of humanity, they really matter. The Pakistan Constitution states that all citizens shall be accorded fundamental rights, including economic and political justice, and freedom of faith and worship. The communities that possess a distinct language, script of culture, shall have the right to preserve the same. The Constitution further states that adequate provisions shall be made so that minorities can freely practice their religions and develop their cultures. In particular, the Constitution of Pakistan mentions minority several times, but does not reference indigenous peoples. Instead, the federal government emphasizes minorities within Pakistan as religious minorities. What is the emphasis? Religious. So they are called religious minorities, not racial or linguistic minorities or indigenous peoples. UNESCO cites some groups of indigenous peoples in Pakistan, such as the Kihals and Moors, and indigenous peoples from the Indus, the Buzdar from Suleiman Mountains, and the Kalash or Kalasha. In Pakistan, regrettably, ladies and gentlemen, the indigenous communities, many of whom live within the borders, are still struggling for recognition and protection of their rights. Pakistan government does not recognize its indigenous people, but refers to them as tribal. Emphasis: tribal, Tribal, tribal. In fact, they refer to most of them as religio ethnic minorities. The population consists of several main ethnic groups in Pakistan: the Punjabis, Pashtuns, Sindhis, Saraikis, Mahajis, Balochis, and the others. This does not take into account the tribal population of the country. The 1998 census brings up tribes in the category of others, quote unquote, OTHERS, others. Tribes comprise Jabils, Kihals, Moors, and Kutanas. The major groups of tribal people are the tribal fishing people, pastoral groups of the Middle Indus Valley, the Baloch tribes, fishing folks of coastal areas, tribal peoples of Sindh, Gilgit-Baltistan, Chitral Valley, Potohar region, and the tribal people of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, KPK, and Fatah. The Kuchis, Rebare, Bakarwal, Kihal, Jogi, Kabutra, Sannasi, and Kalasha are indigenous peoples in Pakistan. Re-emphasize, there's so many names. So you as viewers, ladies and gentlemen, got to understand this and remember that there are differences, although they are, repeated number of times. The Kochis are mostly found in Karachi. They are a nomadic people originally from Afghanistan. The Rebari live in northwest Pakistan. These communities have been living on these lands before the promulgation of any laws and even before the British rule in the subcontinent. In Sindh, the indigenous communities like Bhil, Meghwar, Kolhi, Bagri, Jogi, and Oad, as well as fishermen communities are neither formally recognized nor registered as indigenous peoples, making them weak and vulnerable. Simply extending their lease or occasional intervention by the superior judiciary offers no permanent solution. Although there are other smaller religious groups in Pakistan, including Sikhs, Parsis, Zikris, Baha'i, Buddhist, and Kalasha, the largest and most prominent minority religious groups are Hindus, Christians, and Ahmadis. Now, before I go ahead, I just remember I got to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, you can see I'm wearing a special hat and also a special kind of a scarf. They mostly used to be worn by some of the indigenous peoples in Pakistan. So I'm trying to just mimic them for your benefit and for your liking. Thank you. The Hunza people or Hunza Kuts are people who have lived centuries in their very own isolated valleys. They speak Wakhi and the Shina. The Wakhi reside in the upper part of Hunza, locally called Gojal. Gojal, G-O-G-A-L. Wakhis also inhabit the bordering regions of China, Tajikistan, and Afghanistan, and also live in Gizar and Chitral district of Pakistan. The Shina-speaking people, Shina, S-H-I-N-A, the Shina-speaking people live in the southern part of Hunza. They could have come from Chitral or Chilas, Gilgit, and other Shina-speaking areas of Pakistan centuries ago. A remarkable story of survival is represented by the Kalash people of Chitral. A Dardik, D-A-R-D-I-C, a Dardik indigenous people living in 3 remote valleys near the border with Afghanistan have maintained their unique language, polytheistic faith, and cultural identity. Fantastic, really. What self-indulgence. Pakistan has signed or ratified several international human rights treaties and declarations, including the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, CESCR, CESCR, International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR, Convention on the Rights of the Child and the International Convention on the Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. A very important part of the Constitution. Now, the government of Pakistan does not acknowledge, as I said earlier, an indigenous peoples within Pakistan. The Constitution of Pakistan mentions minority several times. As I said it before also, I am repeating for your benefit, but does not reference indigenous peoples. Instead, the federal government emphasizes minorities within Pakistan as religious minorities, not racial or linguistic minorities or indigenous peoples. So this is a repetition. You might say, why am I repeating? This is for your benefit and for you to remember and for you to see the importance and the similitude of the indigenous people within the context of Pakistan. Now, on the other hand, laws such as the Land Acquisition Act 1894 and Articles 24, 152 and 173 of the Constitution empower the government in effect, that's the catch, in effect to deprive these communities of their lands and natural resources necessary for their survival. You know, this is interesting for a number of reasons. There are many factors within the context of Pakistan. So therefore, there are certain things which could not have been done probably till today. Now, the rights of cultural minorities of indigenous peoples, reflecting Article 30, these are the different ones. Article 30, CRC and Article 27. International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR of 1966. Guarantee, now mind you, this is important, guarantee the specific right of persons belonging to minority and indigenous communities, indigenous peoples or communities, to enjoy their own culture, to profess and practice their own religion, or to use their own language. This is very, very important. On one hand, there are certain things, certain areas where there are restrictions. On the other hand, there is the freedom of the propagation and practice of their various parts of culture and the heritage. There is a perception, though, of absence of liaison between indigenous populace and mainstream society. How media, this is important, how media depicts indigenous individuals and their issues is an important variable affecting the link of indigenous and the mainstream. Lack of representation, along with negativity associated in news stories, reflect that Pakistani press discriminate and marginalize indigenous people. When I'm saying all this, I'm actually making references and quoting from important reports, mostly produced by the United Nations and other international organizations. Now, representation of indigenous people has a significant value in serving, disseminating, and adaptation of traditional values and culture. However, Pakistani mainstream media fails to give substantive representation, coverage, and information about indigenous peoples and their issues. This is again a somewhat repetition, but for you to reflect. Media in Pakistan has the ability, mind you, this is an important element. Media in Pakistan has the ability to alter public opinion, community norms, and create and realize self-identity of masses. In this context, the fair portrayal of ethnic, racial, geographical, and religious minority groups is an essential issue of examination, as media is expected to perform a critical function of informing the masses about minority groups and building public perception of indigenous groups. So, here, to say conversely, so-called media trial of government functionaries and civil society personalities as a matter of rule and for high credit rating continue at full liberty, hardly with any check on ethics, unsolicited advice, and irresponsible journalism by anchors and analysts continue. Of course, this trend is despised, mind you. This is important. This trend is not liked, it is despised by the viewers and civil society, the intelligentsia, the academics, and so on. And the trend, regrettably, often becomes misleading in opinion forming. So, again, these are all references and quotes from different reports, not my own saying, but I'm trying to keep you enlightened with the matter of facts. Majority of people with non-indigenous backgrounds come to learn about cultural artifacts, languages, and issues of indigenous people through the image created by media coverage. So, this is a contribution and important. The public indigenous government nexus. The public indigenous government nexus is built by none other but media, primarily because media does not just inform public about the issues or faced by indigenous groups, but it also has a vital role in the social construction and recognition of who to be seen as indigenous. The idea is to discover the media representation of indigenous people of Pakistan in selected prominent newspapers and to analyze the response of journalists working in these newspapers regarding representation of indigenous peoples. So, ladies and gentlemen, as I am toward the end of my narrative, I would like to draw your attention and emphasize certain points and probably make some suggestions. Dear viewers, there have been some serious research and information collection. Here, therefore, let's reflect on a few recommendations in the Pakistani context. Let us then try and, number one, first of all, fully recognize indigenous peoples in the Constitution of Pakistan. First, fully recognize indigenous peoples in the Constitution of Pakistan. Second, increase cultural awareness of indigenous peoples within the media, so as to dilute cultural misunderstanding and misappropriation. Number three, adopt workable or solid steps to ensure that members of the Kalash are not suffering from forced conversion to Muslim or Islam. Fourth, promote indigenous participation in decision making at all levels, in all matters affecting them, the indigenous people. Fifth, let us involve the UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of the indigenous peoples about their issues in Pakistan. Sixth, ensure that Kailash children have access to primary education in the Kalasha language. Seventh, let us bring about amendment to the curriculum in state-run secondary schools not to compel Kailash students to study Islam. Ninth, let us develop a tangible national action plan. A tangible national action plan on the implementation of the rights of indigenous people based on the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples Outcome document. 10th, the last point and a very important one. Let us carry out consultations and cooperation to help seek out public participation in undertaking projects with indigenous peoples, not endangering their cultural understanding. What I underline or re-emphasize is the cultural understanding. Anything related to culture, heritage, traditions, customs, ways of life, all part of cultural understanding and cultural identity. So that's it. My very good viewers, I am now ending my narrative, and on the occasion of International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, let us vow, V-O-W, let us vow to work toward putting an end to the tragic disparities done to indigenous folks all over the world. These, disparities exist almost anywhere, or every part of the world, not just Pakistan. And to admit and alleviate the abuses they have endured and pay tribute to their cultures. So first, admit and alleviate abuses they have endured so far, and then pay tribute, and rightly so, pay tribute to their cultures, wisdom and parity, as should be shown to the global communities. If we do that, Pakistan will go up in stature. Pakistan will have the pride and the trust of the world, not only of Pakistan. So, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, my very good viewers, especially the younger folks, those who do not know much about indigenous peoples, I would want them to know about them, get close to them, be friendly, trust them and love them. So this is your host, Salahuddin Choudhry, ending this edition of special talk on indigenous peoples of the world, commemorating the UN designated day as duly observed. Good luck, good night, and bless you all.